Okay, so welcome back and Happy New Year. We're really pleased to be back with a bang with the Friday Club in 2022. And we're kicking off our conversations this year with a really impactful, really interesting topic today. I'm really lucky to be joined by both Tom Buchanan and Jane Tozer of Paternoster Communications. Hi, Tom. Hi, Jane. Great to have you here.
Hiya.
So I first got introduced to your work through a UK independent school who talked so much about the work you'd done with them in terms of training them for crisis communications. And I'd not heard of, what schools would have to do around training themselves up to deal with crises. And perhaps before we start our call today, it'd be really interesting if you could tell me a little bit more about what you do at Paternoster Communications.
Paternoster is a specialist agency that offers crisis communications, both training and support for clients. A main chunk of our client base is schools and universities, many of whom, as you would have seen, have been facing quite significant crises that have meant that they've found themselves on the front pages of the newspapers and are often in territory that they're not entirely comfortable looking after themselves.
Okay, brilliant. So it's different from the types of communications that we've probably spoken about on this show in the past, to be honest, Tom, because we talk a lot about how schools communicate to get new admissions inquiries, get people into their events. And this is a very different type of comm style that a school would need to adopt. What type of crises do you see that schools are facing and that they should be ready to handle if those crises do come up for them?
Well, just to say, you're absolutely right. Most of our clients are very sophisticated at placing positive stories in the media that prospective parents are going to read. What they're not experienced with is dealing with that call that we all dread at 4:00 on a Friday afternoon from the Mail on Sunday, who's got some juicy story that they want to splash over the front page in a couple of days' time. So to some extent, schools deal with crises all the time. They're used to dealing with complaints from parents or matters of discipline with pupils and sometimes staff. That's part of the bread and butter of what they do. The crises that they really need to worry about are those that are likely to mean two things for them. First of all, they're going to generate adverse publicity in the mainstream media especially, but also importantly on social media and on sites like Mumsnet that are very influential for schools, as we know. And secondly, they're crises that have the potential to cause widespread damage to the trust that has been built up with key audiences. And we see the key audiences for schools primarily as parents, but also staff. The common room is really important, and also sometimes for the pupil body as well. What you've seen, especially in the days of social media, is that the pupil voice is becoming much, much stronger and needs to be managed very carefully. You can't use the old draconian just shut up or else, because you're seeing pupils speaking on social media much more frequently now.
Absolutely.
So it's quite difficult to be definitive about types of crisis, because the whole point about a crisis is that they're unexpected. But what we're seeing is a lot of allegations of sex abuse by staff or former staff on pupils. More recently, allegations of peer-on-peer abuse, and that's all around the everyone's invited thing. And we might talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. Racism has become very important. BAME pupils bringing to light really shocking treatment historically in schools, which we've had to deal with. Issues around mental health. I know all schools are worrying about this, but the effect specifically of COVID on mental health, but also in a more widespread way, eating disorders, self-harm, very sad to say suicides as well, we have done quite a bit of work with. And last but not least, I'm afraid to say that in some cases, the financial viability of schools is now coming into question. We're conscious that after COVID, a number of schools are struggling. And even if they're not struggling, if there is a sense amongst the parent body that they are, that becomes a sort of a snowball that we need to help stop very rapidly.
I'm just going to jump in one moment because there's another little issue that that we've seen kind of rear its head quite recently, which I hadn't experienced it before, and that's the mental health of staff as well. So, I mean, everything we do is confidential, but we've seen the same problems creeping into the staff room that we've seen in the classroom, really, on mental health during COVID. It's
a really good point. Resilience and mental health, the after effects of COVID, particularly mixed mode teaching and the stresses that's put on staff, is a very big deal. So we don't always just communicate with the media for our clients. We'll often help senior leadership teams to work out what to say to their own staff body, for example, what support they might want to put in place, how they can feel open and caring, which is a really important thing at the moment.
Absolutely. Understood. So these are really hard-hitting topics of conversation and things that don't just come up as you're having a casual chat with your colleagues. And perhaps for somebody like me who's been involved in those positive communications that schools find easier, it's not something that I've had a lot of exposure to. And I suspect that schools might feel like they're the only ones dealing with issues. How many schools do you think are affected by these issues?
Well, do you know what? Every single school is going to be affected to some degree or another. You don't go through a career in any school without something, fairly unpleasant happening at some stage. Might not be as huge as the everyone's invited movement that we've seen recently, but there's going to be historical cases of abuse allegations, maybe about staff that left decades ago, but you still have to handle them compassionately, take them seriously. Make sure that you support the people that are concerned. I mean, sometimes we're dealing with ladies in their 60s that have come forward after years and years and years. But the school still needs to be able to support what are essentially ex-pupils, albeit from a very long time ago. Now, obviously, there's unlikely to be any of the staff even left in the school teaching at that point. But that doesn't mean to say that your duty of care has run clear. And so, I would say literally every single school.
Yeah, and just to back that up, I mean, any school that is or was a boarding establishment, our view is the chances are at some stage in their lives there will have been incidents of child abuse. It's a terrible thing to say, but I think certainly in the generation when I was at school, it was endemic. And one thing we do suggest that schools can do is to go quietly through HR records and look at staff who've been terminated in their employment very rapidly and just do a little bit of delving around why that might be, because actually being prepared is quite a sensible thing to be.
Yeah, and a lot of
sorry, I was just going to say I can't back that up enough, because actually it's incredible. I know we talk about these things coming out of the blue and not expecting them, but as Tom says, there is a way that you can anticipate the possibility of something coming up, and there's lots that you can do to prepare for that ahead of the game, actually. And if you are prepared, then it sets you in. I mean, I can't tell you how much easier it is to deal with a situation if you have your ducks in a row before it kicks off.
Absolutely. And I'm going to say one more thing, Sophie, I'm sorry. Former head teachers are a goldmine in this regard. And another thing we do suggest schools do is go to the sort of typically sort of in their 80s or 90s retired head and say, is there anything in your tenure or that you heard about that should cause us any concern? Because the world was so different then. There are no written records. Teachers were passed from school to school with clean references or with slightly odd references. And it's quite difficult, therefore, to piece together what might be the problem for the specific school.
And there was also a climate of real secrecy back then, and that's all changing. Everyone's seen what's happened with the #MeToo movement, with everyone's invited and everything else. And it's giving people the confidence to come forward and talk about experiences that perhaps are decades old.
Yeah.
Yeah. So who do you think should own that being prepared? Is that a communications department in the school? Is it marketing? Or is it a wider community in the school?
Can I answer that, Jane?
Yep.
Sorry. This is a big enough issue that it should be owned by the senior leadership team. The head should certainly be involved. The governor body should also be involved too. Schools, of course, are becoming much more attuned to risk registers. And we think reputational risk should be on those risk registers, just as health and safety and everything else should be. Typically, in our experience, it's a combination of bursar, head of marketing or comms, and if there's an HR person, because there's a certain amount of kind of digging through files that need to be done. So ownership rests everywhere, but I think it stops really quite high up in the organisation.
Absolutely. And when something like this does come out, I'm sure it's really shocking and difficult to deal with for the team and the students there, no matter how prepared you are. What practices or support do you suggest schools have in place to help their little community in the school itself handle the news that may or may not come out?
Can I go?
Okay.
I mean, all schools will have safeguarding leads, and they'll have those structures in place. They certainly should have, and if they haven't, and they want to be having some very serious internal conversations, and those people should be trained. In boarding establishments, that's absolutely de rigueur now, and I'd be very surprised if a school didn't have that sort of arrangement in place already.
One big topic of conversation that I know you've spoken to me about, Jane, and I've seen talked about quite a lot online is the everyone's invited area of conversation. And I'm sure that that's come up in lots of times for you when you talk with schools.
I mean, everyone's invited was massive earlier this year. I mean, really massive. I mean, I think for a couple of weeks, I worked pretty much round the clock, including weekends, just trying to make sure that our schools were fairly represented in the press. I mean, it was a really febrile atmosphere at the time, and schools were getting disproportionately blamed for stuff. It was a bit like a stone thrown into a pond, you know, and the closer you were to that original epicenter, which was Sarasota, then your school was perhaps disproportionately represented in those testimonials. And a lot of our schools were right at the centre there because it came out of the sort of London day school territory, and we look after a lot of schools in that particular area, and then it kind of rippled out from there. I mean, a lot of it was just encouraging schools to be calm about it and to actually take on board what was being said. And the first thing that we encouraged everybody to do was to have face-to-face meetings with anybody that had come out with a specific allegation against a specific school. Mm-hmm. Invite the girls in and have compassionate and you know, eye-to-eye conversations about what had happened to them, not to dismiss it. You have to be in real listening mode at that very beginning. And actually in doing that, not being overly defensive, you can dissipate an awful lot of the antipathy that's coming from, you know, the person that's suffered the alleged abuse.
Absolutely. And alongside that, can I just add one thing, Jane? We have a mantra at Paternoster that key audiences should not learn things about the school by reading about them online or in the newspapers. So what we can help schools do, who tend to be in some sense of panic, and one response to panic is just to put your head beneath a parapet and hope it's going to go away. And what we can do is, in a quite calm, professional way, say, actually, this is how this will play out. You've had a call from the Evening Standard. You're a very well-known school. It is inevitable this story is going to be written. So actually, why don't we construct what we want to say to parents and staff now? And typically that has to happen really quickly because we're dealing with newspaper deadlines in the background. What do you want to say ahead to your key constituents that makes it look as if you're in control, you're empathetic, to Jane's point, you're dealing with this properly and appropriately, and you're protecting everybody. And that actually with communications is possible to do. And that's really where we step in and help.
And, you know, that press engagement is really important. You can't just ignore them when something like this hits, because it makes you look shifty and evasive. It is much better to meet it head on. If there have been proven allegations, you need to be able to hold your hands up and own it. Do something about it. and do something to make sure that it isn't going to happen again. And if you behave like that, you'd be surprised how forgiving the press can be.
Yes.
One of the things that really stuck with me, Jane, when we spoke before, is you said that schools can actually say too much. So one response, Tom, as you've pointed out, is to kind of stick your head under the sand. And another way to react might be to say too much. And where do you think the right balance is for schools?
It's a really good point, and another reaction to the kind of onslaught from some schools is we're completely open and honest. We're going to tell everybody everything because that's what we need to be, because we're an open and honest organisation. And there's just a tactical risk there that the school suddenly becomes the kind of the poster child of the problem.
Yeah.
So getting that balance right, getting an appropriate level of disclosure directly to your audiences. The joy about schools is you know exactly who you need to talk to. You have lists, you have mailing lists. Parents are used to reading emails from the school. You can speak to them instantly and directly, so that the tone of those communications be very different to what you say to the Evening Standard, which might be just a pretty terse 2-sentence statement with nothing more that acknowledges the problem, acknowledges it's being dealt with, acknowledges you've met the pupils involved, to Jane's point. That might be just plenty. You don't want it to become, the school's problem if it's a sector-wide issue.
Absolutely. And I think,
but Tom's right. It's a very fine balance. And the good thing about having somebody like us on board is that we can be very impartial about it. You can imagine when something like this hits a school, emotions run very high. It's very, very difficult not to take it personally when you eat, live and breathe a school. It feels very personal when something like this happens. And your reactions don't want to be kind of heightened by that sense of emotion. So,
yes.
So it's another layer to put in between, and we can strike the right balance and make sure that, like you say, you don't over communicate, you don't under communicate.
And that's especially true if there's a situation of current child abuse where a member of staff has been removed from the premises. The sense of shock actually within a school that somebody could have done that and could have betrayed, obviously, the pupils' trust, but the trust of other staff members too. It's a really horrible place, actually, that we can go into, not sort of toughened, but at least experienced, and we can empathetically explain how these things will play out and why these things need to be said, and why, for example, a journalist who's asking difficult questions is only doing their job and doesn't need to be treated as if they are arch enemy number one, but needs to be treated professionally. There are all sorts of things that you just can't do from the inside because it's so horrible, that we can come in and just say, no, it's fine, don't worry, this is the way it's going to be. This is going to be a tough conversation, but you're going to have it. This is the conversation you're going to need to have now with your governors, for example, to keep them on side. And that's all the sort of thing that, because we've done it
even
lots.
as much as like, this is how the inquest is going to play out, this is the likely police procedure that will be gone through, just being able to rely on somebody that has seen that happen elsewhere on multiple occasions, to be able to have that reassurance, I think can mean quite a lot to staff going through it.
Knowing what to expect, I think, can be a real reassurance when you're in shock and surprise.
Yeah.
On that note, what happens after a crisis? So let's say something has come out in the mainstream media, there's been a crisis management period. How can a school get back to normal and reassure students, parents, and the community it serves?
Jane, why don't you answer that?
Well, for a start, I'll say it's often a really neglected aspect of it. There's a real danger that you come out the end of it and go, that's all over. And it isn't really. It's really important that schools keep that communication line open with anybody that was affected at the time. Really important if they've made commitments, whether internally or externally, to do something as a result of it, that they actually go on and do that. And to remind themselves 6 months, a year down the line, whatever it is, to look back and say, were there any commitments that we made that we had yet to fulfill? And if you haven't, get on and do it. but I think Tom will agree with me, you know, collective memories fade pretty quickly. And if you have handled something well and you haven't exacerbated the situation, then it's going to dissipate relatively quickly. One addendum to that is obviously there is still Mr. Google out there, and whatever you do, whenever your school is searched, it is likely that this is going to be raked up again. And that's when it's important to be aware of anniversaries or significant events that you can perhaps just steel yourself for something else popping up again.
Can I add one more thing? In terms of the aftermath, what we tend to find is that one or two members of key audiences, so one or two parents, one or two staff members, will continue to try and process this by being potentially quite aggressive with the school. And that's another thing that externally we can say is actually don't think that what two parents are saying is a representative view of the parent body. Parents tend to be incredibly forgiving if they're communicated with properly during the crisis and that trust is maintained. They will tend to forgive and actually forget really quite quickly, particularly around issues of historic child abuse, for example. And I'm afraid to say that certainly for those parents who were the product of independent schools themselves, they tend to be fully aware what they were like. And therefore, they're quite pragmatic about it, as long as they feel, one, they've been communicated to properly, and two, that there is no risk whatsoever to their own kids. And that's the key thing. Parents go into parent mode and they're very protective of their own children. And as long as those bases are covered, the aftermath, the rebuild can happen pretty quickly and pretty successfully.
And you know, that's one of the first things that you'll make very clear in a situation like that, is that it's been contained and you're very clear about who it hasn't affected.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like extending that understanding, that empathy to the parent community as well is really, really important, because emotions will of course run high when we're talking about our own children. So
yeah,
can understand that.
I mean, in an independent school, the parents are the customers. And schools sometimes lose sight of that, but they, you know, they are the people who pay the money to pay the staff to keep the school going. So they are the absolute key audience.
You know, Tom and I are both parents. I retrained as a teacher in the middle of my comms career and taught for 8 years. So I've actually been in the staff room and kind of understand the workings of the school from the inside out as well. And often I find talking, you know, when we're dealing with schools, they find that quite reassuring as well, having somebody around that actually has been there, walked in their shoes.
Yes, and I'm chair of governors of an independent school, because I can bring the governance and the oversight, and I can bring the voice of the governor to the table. So say to the head, actually, this is what the governors are going to grill you on tomorrow. So let's make sure that we've got all these things in a row, and that's incredibly reassuring for them.
Yeah. Very much so.
Imagine. So your company is there to help schools when they're in the midst of this crisis, but you also have some crisis simulation tools as well. Could you tell us a bit more about those and how schools can access them?
Yeah, certainly. So we realized some time ago, you know, what you were saying earlier, that schools are just not geared up for this kind of thing. They're very much marketing oriented and they're very good at all of that kind of thing. And actually, why would you train somebody specifically for something that comes around once in a blue moon? It doesn't make that much sense. So we developed a school's crisis simulation package. So it's online. You do it in real time. So you log on and it kicks off from that moment on. And what happens is an unfolding historical sex abuse case in a fictional school, obviously. And you sit there as the comms person dealing with this bombardment of emails, voicemails, social media posts, inquiries from the press. It goes on and on. I've done it myself, and I have to say, it really gets the adrenaline pumping and gives you as much as you can without, you know, really going through it, a taste of what it's like to be in the maelstrom, right in the eye of that media storm when it kicks off. Now, listen, we're not pretending that you do this crisis simulation and you're going to be ready to, you know, deal with the next one single-handedly. But what it does do is kind of stress test your weak points in the school. It makes you think about what would you do in that situation? What have you got in place? What you haven't got in place, more importantly, and gives you the opportunity to almost do an audit of your processes, so that you can go back and plug in some of those gaps, and maybe realize that, you know, having somebody's telephone like us on the side is not a bad thing to have.
Yes. And what we've seen also is that actually heads of comms and heads of marketing tend to be pretty attuned to these risks.
Yeah.
But often they're dealing with a situation where schools are humming along nicely. Senior leadership teams, heads, governors have not really clocked this. The sim, I mean, slightly cheekily, if you make a head sit down for 45 minutes and do the sim, he begins to realize, or she begins to realize, quite how serious this could be, and it's quite a good way for the organisation as a whole to start attuning themselves to this risk, we find. So it's a useful door opener. It's not everything, as Jane says, but it's quite an interesting introduction, I think.
It really is. And the people that we know that have done it and sat through it have come away with some real insight into what might happen were it to be for real next time.
Absolutely. I think this is such an important topic. I would love to share that resource and your contacts with all of the subscribers to the Friday Club, because I think It's a topic that every school would probably like to make sure they're as armed as possible to cope with. So if it's okay with you both, I will link that back into the newsletter, and our schools listening to this will be able to find it below.
And Sophie, just to say, we two things. First of all, lots and lots of schools have us on their Rolodex for that rainy day, and we're really happy to do that. And the other thing is we're really happy to do is to have a completely free conversation with schools who think they're in trouble. We are very committed to schools. We realise that most of them are charitable organisations. Most of them are doing really brilliant things for their kids. A 15-minute conversation with Jane or me about how to handle a situation, we're so happy to do, as slightly as part of our marketing, but also because we believe in offering goodwill to schools in that way. So anybody who's watching this, if they have got a problem, just pick up the phone and we'll have a sensible chat about how it plays out.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing such a difficult topic and a difficult conversation, but giving airtime to it and showing schools what they can do, how they can be prepared. I am really glad that we've had this come up today on the Friday Club. So huge thank you to you both for joining me.
Thank you, Sophie. It's no fun describing yourself as two of the UK's experts on historic child abuse in schools, but unfortunately that's what we are, and we have very specific skills that we can give.
Yes, can you imagine? Well, thank you so much. We're really, really grateful to have you as experts on, and I know that this will add so much value to our listeners when this goes out in the new year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie.